right, thank you, Doug. That was actually a really elegant and informative summary itself, so I'm tempted to just retire and say Doug summed it up. And thank you more broadly for your continued friendship and your support of not only this book, but all of my work. And I know there's some people out there in Zoom land, so I want to...
Do we need to click on something?
I don't think so, I just minimized it.
Oh, okay.
I want to thank the university for making this program available on Zoom. As many of you might know, Reverend Jesse Jackson has Parkinson's disease, and there are many people with Parkinson's disease and similar conditions, disabilities, and some of whom have just become infirm in their elderly years who would like to attend events such as these, but don't have the opportunity to do so because physical travel has become difficult. So I'm pleased to speak with those of you watching on Zoom, as well as those of you right here in person. The central thesis and contention of my book, I Am Somebody, Why Jesse Jackson Matters, for which I spent 6 years conducting interviews with Reverend Jesse Jackson. I interviewed many of his current staff and former staff, as well as other intellectuals who are interested in issues of racial and social justice and democratic small d and large d politics, is that Jesse Jackson is the most consequential civil rights leader in our country since Dr. King. And he is one of the most consequential and formidable and accomplished human rights leaders advocating and striving for the full-fledged activation of multiracial democracy with an international application in the world. And yet, most people, as Professor Swartz was just summarizing, have little to no regard for his sterling and massive resume of achievements in human rights and contributions to social justice. So it is on the latter that I will focus the bulk and body of today's presentation. But I'd like to begin with some examples of the former. So most people are aware that Jesse Jackson was a young aide to Martin Luther King in the 1960s. They met in Selma, Alabama, where they were both participants in the Bloody Sunday March for voting rights and to oppose the systemic disenfranchisement of Black Americans. And yes, Jesse Jackson, as recently as this last summer, was arrested in Texas and Arizona and Georgia in marches, once again, opposing the disenfranchisement of Black Americans and, more broadly, non-white Americans. So as much as we've progressed in certain respects, unfortunately, and much to our democratic tragedy, we've also regressed and moved backward. After the assassination of Martin Luther King, and Martin Luther King's last words were spoken to Jesse Jackson while he was on the balcony of the Lorraine Motel. Jesse Jackson was underneath in the courtyard. Reverend Jackson began to focus intensely on issues of economic justice. So he began to realize that political freedom, political equality, and this is a theme that will continue as the talk progresses, and it's also one that progresses throughout the course of Jackson's life and career, is important, but lacking its full potential without economic equity and parity in terms of not only opportunity and access, but resources and distribution of wealth. So what he found in Chicago was a system of economic apartheid. And one of the mistakes of history, at least the way it's often rendered in the secondary school system, and the way that many Americans, particularly white Americans, have come to understand, is that systemic institutional racism was exclusively a sin of the southern United States. So perhaps cities like Chicago and cities like Gary and cities like Cleveland and Detroit didn't have the full breadth of Jim Crow denial of public accommodations to black citizens, but they also had rampant redlining, which created the ghettoization effect of black families and black communities. They also had systematic hiring discrimination and bias, and the construction of an awfully low ceiling on how high black workers and entrepreneurs could rise, no matter level of talent, ability, creativity, or industriousness. And we also had the routine denial of government contracts for black business owners and the routine exclusion of black workers from trade unions. So one can begin to see how acquiring the right to vote, as important as it is, ending legally enforced segregation, as important as it is, would fail to achieve equality, the type of equality that we should all understand is essential and imperative for a multiracial democracy, if this economic apartheid was in existence. So Reverend Jackson led an organization called Operation Breadbasket, which would later morph into his own organization, Operation Push. And their focus, first and foremost, was to combat against economic apartheid, was to combat against systemic racism in the distribution of jobs, opportunities, access to economic resources, the creation of neighborhoods, capital, so on and so forth. The history department at Middlebury University has concluded that the work Reverend Jackson led in the 1970s on those issues is the most important but unrecognized story of the civil rights movement in American history. So Jackson led negotiations for thousands of jobs for previously excluded black workers, thousands of jobs for previously excluded black workers, not only in business, but also in trade unions, and tens of millions of dollars of ancillary benefits through product placement, access to capital, construction of neighborhoods, and so on and so forth. And as a result, Chicago became something of an epicenter of black entrepreneurship. The first black-owned bank after the Tulsa riots opened in Chicago. The first black-owned PR companies opened in Chicago. Ebony and Jet magazine opened their offices in Chicago. So it transformed not only the economic landscape of the city of Chicago, but it of course then permeated into other cities to not entirely transform, unfortunately, but at least reform some of the economic situation as it pertained to racial equity. So that was the 1970s. In the 1980s, Reverend Jackson led the most successful voter registration drive in American history, at the time at least, registering 6 million Americans to vote. And when he ran for president the first time in 1984, he was the first presidential candidate to support gay rights. He was the first presidential candidate to speak on Native American reservations. He was the first presidential candidate to hold events with a Spanish language translator in Latino neighborhoods and communities. He was the first presidential candidate to speak directly with Asian immigrant organizations. And he also, at a time when it was considered radical and fringe, advocated for a universal Medicare for all healthcare system, tuition-free higher education, full employment through a massive infrastructure and public service, jobs creation and beatification program, paid family leave, subsidized child care. In other words, all of the hallmarks of social democracy for which progressive Democrats are still fighting, but for which it was also difficult to find a voice in the 1980s. In 1984, Jesse Jackson received approximately 20% of the popular vote, but only 4% of the delegates at the nominating convention. We have the strange system in which delegates actually nominate the candidate for president, not the voters themselves. One of the most painful and ridiculous experiences I've ever had was when I was giving a Zoom talk to an audience in London, and a woman asked me to explain the delegate nominating process and the Electoral College. Try doing that to someone and you'll be able to measure the distance between what we claim about our democracy and how it actually exists in practice. Jackson recognized that as fundamentally unfair and unjust, and he recognized it as a means for the Democratic Party to nullify the voices and votes of millions of people. So he and his staff lobbied and fought hard. There's some insider baseball you can read in the book to change the nominating system to one of proportional allocation of delegates. Meaning, if I get 51% of the vote in the state of Indiana and Doug gets 49% of the vote, rather than me getting 100% of the delegates, I get 51% of the delegates. Had it not been for that change that Jackson engineered, Barack Obama would have never won the Democratic nomination in 2008, and therefore, obviously, he would have never become president, because Hillary Clinton won all of the large states, or almost all of them, and Obama pieced together a victory by collecting overall wins in small states. That is a fact that does not appear in any of the major books on the Obama candidacy or presidency. Also in the 80s, Jackson successfully negotiated the release of a hostage in Syria. He also successfully negotiated the release of over 30 political prisoners in Cuba. And according to the leading Cuban historians and historians of the Protestant Church, negotiated the first steps of Fidel Castro allowing for further exercise of religious liberty in Cuba. That's something else that we never hear about. There's a lot of talk now about mass incarceration. Jesse Jackson has spent every single Christmas day since 1968 in the Cook County Jail, with the exception of last year due to the pandemic. So I start with these accomplishments not only to provide a summary of just some of the contributions that Jackson's made in his legendary and important career, but because, as Doug was just saying, setting me up quite well, it's likely that many, if not all of you, were unaware of these accomplishments. If not unaware of all of them, then at least unaware of many of them. And that is not an accident. That's not happenstance. And it's not merely because Jackson on occasion might have made a regrettable statement, or maybe he had a scandal in his personal life. It's because of a concerted effort on account of the major political parties in our country, the multinational corporations that fund them, and the major media outlets in our country, which are also owned by multinational corporations. And this isn't an underground conspiracy theory. It's nothing as simple as, several villainous white men smoking cigars and drinking high-priced spirits in back rooms. It actually goes to the fundamental and elemental functioning of institutions in our society, about which I'll say a little more. But before I do that, I will remind everyone here and watching at home that Jesse Jackson was not the first target of systemic and systematic slander. It happened to Dr. King before it happened to him. Because we have a holiday for Martin Luther King, and because there are many streets and schools and libraries named after him, as there should be, many Americans have a tendency to forget, or perhaps younger ones never realized, that at the hour of Dr. King's death, he was largely a despised man in the United States. He was condemned by Life magazine. He was condemned by Time magazine. He was condemned by the New York Times. He was condemned by the Chicago Tribune. He was condemned by leading figures in the Republican Party, but also leading figures in the Democratic Party, such as Mayor Richard Daley in Chicago. And a poll taken just months before his assassination showed that 68% of Americans had disapproving views of Dr. King. Even many black Americans began to turn on Dr. King because there were some black Americans who believed that his opposition to the Vietnam War and his expansion of his effort to include economic justice would distract the public and those in power from the necessary and righteous cause of the civil rights movement. So this brings us to a very recent appearance that I made on WGN television. And this is actually an illustration of both explicit bias and implicit bias at work. So I was on WGN television wearing the same tie, which my mother bought me, who's sitting in the back there. And the reporters on the show asked me all of two questions. So first they asked me, what did you learn about Jesse Jackson? So that's why I wrote this book, because I learned a lot about Jesse Jackson, but I had about 30 seconds to summarize 288 pages, which was a little difficult. But then the second question from their male anchor, and I'm not accusing him of racism. I don't know anything about him. He's either a racist himself, or he's like a child who believes Santa Claus is real. Nobody's told him anything different. Asked me, he read a quote from my book from the New York Times about accusing a certain civil rights leader of distracting from the cause of racial equality because he was obsessed with fame and publicity. And the anchor assumed this quote was about Jesse Jackson and put it to me as a challenge. Well, it's in my book, so I know who wrote the quote and who it's about. It's about Dr. Martin Luther King. But this anchor or his staff who read that book, in all likelihood, or read my book, didn't even take the time to read to the end of the paragraph to learn the real target of that allegation and that slander, but it also neatly coalesced with the anchor's own bias, that Jesse Jackson is a publicity seeker. And he has that bias because it's something that he's heard for decades. But then when he has me on his program and he asks me that question, he keeps the bias alive. See, that's how it works, and that's why this relationship is so destructive between ignorance that so often accompanies implicit bias and lies and propaganda and misinformation that are necessary for the extension and enlargement of explicit bias. So he goes from being a victim of the concerted campaign to distort the legacy of Jesse Jackson to victimizer because he's on television. Shortly after that, I did a 2-hour interview with a writer for the Chicago Tribune for an article that just came out ostensibly about Jesse Jackson's legacy to coincide with his 80th birthday. I told the writer for the Tribune everything that I mentioned at the beginning of my talk here today. And also, she had claimed to have read my book, and it's all in here in much more detail. And yet none of that appears in the article. And it's not about my own aggrandizement. I'm not a publicity seeker. If she would have included some of Jackson's accomplishments but didn't quote me, that would have been fine. But what is included in the article is a reference to a certain anti-Semitic slur that Jackson uttered in the 1980s, for which he's apologized many times. But there's no mention that Jackson, for decades now, has had a long-standing and productive relationship with many synagogues and Jewish organizations in the city of Chicago and elsewhere, including the Illinois Holocaust Memorial Museum. No mention of that, but there's a mention of the slur, of course. And then there's also a mention that around 24 years ago, it was revealed that Reverend Jesse Jackson, despite being a minister and a married man, had fathered a child out of wedlock as the result of an extramarital affair. Now, I will ask you, because I would assume that most of the small but mighty group here are consumers of news media and well-read and watch CNN. When President George W. Bush recently made his book tour, because he had some book of paintings of immigrants that he was trying to promote, did every article and every story on George W. Bush include a mention that there were no weapons of mass destruction in Iraq? Did every story include a reference to black folks dying on rooftops and in the Superdome in New Orleans during Hurricane Katrina, while the federal government wasn't on the ground for 5 days and he did a flyover looking out the window? Did anyone mention the implementation of torture, a war crime by the Geneva Conventions? Now, we also, I would say this, Donald Trump, another former president, another great gift to this country from the Republican Party, he's received plenty of bad press. However, how many articles about him mention that 27 women have accused him of sexual assault? And yet, every time I do an interview, the only exception was Tavis Smiley, radio host, former talk show host. Every time I do an interview about Jesse Jackson, someone brings up his extramarital affair. Now, these are examples of how I have confronted these various biases and prejudices and propagandistic techniques and tactics at work. I want to take a step back now from my own personal experience and address this issue of implicit bias, because with all due respect to the authors of this book, Blind Spot, Hidden Biases of Good People, we have to understand that implicit bias, if something is implicit, if someone possesses a stereotype but is unaware of that possession, it's not inherent in the same terms that we could understand the influence of the subconscious that a psychoanalyst needs to unpack for the patient. Or it's not like an innate human need like hunger or thirst. It's not something that's just there as part of human nature. Someone, in other words, has to put it there. So if we're going to understand implicit bias, we therefore have to develop an understanding of explicit bias. And when I wrote this book, I had come to realize that through an analysis and study of the life and work of Jesse Jackson, one also has to study and analyze the forces of opposition against what he's fighting to achieve. And if we understand that what he's fighting to achieve is racial equality and equity, social and economic justice, and the full-fledged activation of a multiracial democracy that can cut through the divide and conquer tactics of the ruling class and the political class, then what is in opposition to Jesse Jackson are those who want to preserve systemic racism, those who want to preserve rule by the rich, those who want to preserve multinational corporations exerting more influence over our political and judicial process than the voting public. So therefore, we have to ask ourselves, how do institutions work? You'll notice that if you can watch CNN for 24 hours a day, and you'll notice also, by the way, I'm not really even talking about Fox News or Newsmax, or, I mean, they're just so insane and at this point brazenly racist that it's not really illuminative to discuss their bias. They wear it on their sleeve proudly. You can watch 24 hours a day of CNN. You can subscribe to the New York Times and the Chicago Tribune and the Indianapolis Star. And even as you're awash in political debates and discourse, you will rarely, if ever, read an explanation of how institutions actually work. What are their interests? What are their incentives? And therefore, what agenda do they enact according to those incentives to serve those interests? So the institutions that most opposed and continue to oppose the work of Jesse Jackson are forces within the two major political parties. So essentially all of the Republican Party, and then more conservative and centrist members within the Democratic Party, and also major multinational corporations. It's helpful to return to the work of Noam Chomsky and Edward S. Herman. They wrote a book called Manufacturing Consent, The Political Economy of the Mass Media. And according to Chomsky and Herman's analysis, which I would argue is really essential for understanding how media institutions work, it's not so simple as there's breaking news, the news outlet, whether it's broadcast or textual, sends a reporter, and the reporter tells the viewers or the readers what happened. Rather, stories that receive coverage in the news have to pass through three key filters. So there's all kinds of discussion about bias in the media. The right wing accuses everything other than Fox of having a liberal bias, and many liberals argue otherwise. But what they tend to do is focus on the personalities that we see when we turn on the TV, or the names of the writers in the byline underneath a story. Chomsky and Herman argue this is fundamentally flawed, and it will lead to widespread confusion about how the media works. It would be like complaining to the cashier at a fast food restaurant because you don't like their food. Well, the cashier has nothing to do with the recipes, the production of the food, the cultivation of the menu, the advertisement of the food. So first we have to look to ownership. That's the first filter. It's not to say that reporters don't matter and there aren't any differences between them. Obviously, I would rather throw in with Chris Hayes than Tucker Carlson. But first we have to look to ownership. Who owns these media companies? And what are their interests? And therefore, what is their agenda? Well, right now, 5 multinational corporations own nearly all of our news media. In the 1980s, when Jesse Jackson ran for president, it was, I think, 8 multinational corporations. And these are for-profit institutions. So therefore, they are not going to allow anything on the air, or they're going to discourage the broadcast of anything on the air or in their pages that interferes with their acquisition of profit. And not merely the acquisition of profit, but the maximization of profit. We've seen this recently with Facebook. Hate speech, propaganda, if you want to call it fake news, all of that was a problem on Facebook before 2018. But we've learned that in 2018, Facebook changed its algorithm so its users would more frequently see stories that would anger them. So it increases polarization and tribalism and hatred. Well, Facebook prior to 2018 was a multi-billion-dollar multinational company. So we're seeing a borderline psychotic level of greed here, that it's not enough to make billions of dollars every year. We have to maximize profit. So if Jesse Jackson is devoting 7 days a week and using his media prominence and his charisma and his intellect and marshaling the resources of his committed staff and volunteers and voters across the country to condemn corporate America for racism, sexism, and for the deliberate exploitation of workers and deceit of consumers, he's created a very powerful set of enemies. And these enemies happen to own the major media companies. So that's the first filter it has to pass through, ownership. But then we also have to ask, how do these media companies make their money? They make their money primarily through advertising. Well, who are the advertisers? Okay, it's not me advertising my book. It's not the charming mom and pop store or neighborhood bar that we all love to frequent in our hometowns. It's big pharma, it's the fossil fuel industry, it's the automobile companies, it's fast food. So in other words, it's the exact type of companies with the exact same type of profile that own these media outfits. So every story that they report will pass through the filter of ownership and then the filter of advertising. And obviously, big pharma and the fossil fuel industry and any other major corporate sector that we can identify would also oppose a dissident figure who is attempting to bring to bear a sense of righteous anger and a sense of nationwide activism on the various misdeeds of corporate America, and also bring it to bear on the political system, which has the power to regulate, punish, and transform corporate America. So that brings us to the next filter that Chomsky and Herman identified, which is sources. When you turn on cable news or open a major newspaper, reporters have to quote sources. You'll notice that most of the sources on which they rely are current members or former members of the political establishment or the military-industrial complex. So let's take a look at a recent story in the news: the withdrawal of U.S. forces from Afghanistan. Whenever I went to a major mainstream media source to learn about the withdrawal of U.S. forces from Afghanistan, I saw retired generals, I saw Congress people who voted for the war, I saw senators who voted for the war. I didn't see Jesse Jackson, who as early as December of 2001 was touring the country in a call for diplomacy and economic pressure as an alternative for war. I didn't see David Swanson, who is the founder and director of World Beyond War, one of the leading anti-war organizations in the country. And to that extent, I barely even saw Congresswoman Barbara Lee, who was the only member of Congress in late 2001 to vote against the war in Afghanistan. So the third filter, conveniently for the first and second filter, reaffirms and echoes the talking points and the prevailing positions of the major multinational companies that pay for the advertising and, in a sense, own the news. Now, in Manufacturing Consent, Chomsky also talks about how one of the important tactics of the media, acting through these filters, is the creation of a culture of fear. So there are always people we have to fear. There are always different people coming to the country who threaten us, or different ideologies that threaten us, or it could be anything from critical race theory, which was an obscure theory, very useful, very helpful for understanding American history, but largely obscure, relegated to law schools, or it could be vaccine mandates, but something is threatening us. Everything except maybe the fact that you don't have health care, or maybe the fact that climate change is eroding ecology, or maybe the fact that wages have stagnated for 40 years. So there's an effort to make you deeply afraid of everything except what's actually troubling and hindering your life. Part of that is, if you remember the title of the book, Manufacturing Consent, in order to manufacture consent, one would therefore have to discredit and defame and discourage dissent. And Reverend Jesse Jackson was and is a leading dissenter. He's a dissident leader in our country. So if Jackson is attempting to amplify a vision of democracy that includes poor white family farmers, to whom he directly campaigned during his presidential runs, poor white mine workers in Kentucky, and working class blacks in the inner cities who are looking at the threat of deindustrialization, and Asian Americans in San Francisco and elsewhere, and Native Americans on reservations, and Latino Americans in the barrios, and college students and the elderly, and LGBT Americans, well, that's a threat. That's a threat to those prevailing interests. So to manufacture consent, one has to discredit and defame and distort dissent, and thereby encourage the fear of the dissenter. And what we're learning right now is actually kismet, that this Facebook revelation occurred, the whistleblower, because for my talk, the universe working in my favor, I suppose, what we're learning is one of the fundamental truths that Karl Marx first introduced in his analysis of capitalism, that for all of these so-called revolutions, moving from an agricultural economy to an industrial economy, and then after Marx's death, moving from an industrial economy to a service-based economy, and now a technologically based economy, the arrangement stays the same. We're dealing with different tools. We're dealing with different means of production, but the essential institutional interest that I referred to earlier remains the same. So Facebook is behaving exactly as we would have expected the Chicago Tribune, say, or Time Warner, they go with a larger company, Time Warner, to have behaved in the 1990s or the 1980s, or News Corp, Rupert Murdoch's lovely company. So explicit bias creates implicit bias. And I'll give you a couple examples relating it back to Jesse Jackson. Emerson College did a study of the Jesse Jackson presidential campaigns of the 1980s, more specifically the coverage that those campaigns received. And they found that over 2/3 of the stories that ran on the Jackson campaigns in the New York Times, Newsweek, and the Chicago Tribune were negative in nature and found a way to lead with his race, and not only lead with his race by saying something innocuous, like, he's the first black candidate who might win the Democratic nomination, but to depict him as fundamentally outside and alien to the American political system and the so-called American values that it represents. So, for example, when Jesse Jackson declared his candidacy the second time in 1988, Newsweek put him on the cover with the headline, "What does Jesse want?" So it can't be that Jesse wants to become president of the United States so he can enact the agenda that he's describing in every speech. He has to have some secret motivation. So simultaneously, George H.W. Bush, the friendly face of right-wing politics, was calling Jesse Jackson in interviews and speeches a hustler and a thug. So this is the reaction that he received when he ran for president. And simultaneously, he was bringing millions of voters into the Democratic Party for the first time. So instead of talking about that, we're talking about, what does Jesse want? Or in the New York Times' words, Jesse Jackson believes that he is a serious candidate. They put it in scare quotes. And that was a news story, not an editorial. Excuse me. So before Jesse Jackson, and one thing I'll tell you to look for with this, one way that explicit bias is created, very subtly, is the news story that leads with, and this was done countless times. If you had time, we could walk over to the library, I could pull up all the old stories for you. It was done in the 70s, the 80s, and the 90s, even as Jackson's negotiating the release of hostages from Saddam Hussein's Iraq and Slobodan Milosevic's Serbia. Jackson reacts to criticism. That's the headline. And then what follows is an 8-paragraph story, 5 of which is summarizing the criticism against him. So all of us are smart enough to see what's going on there. If I write a story for Salon, Professor Doug Swartz reacts to criticism, and don't worry, he looked very concerned. And I spend 5 of the 8 paragraphs summarizing the criticisms from multiple sources. What I'm really doing is spotlighting the criticism. And I'm doing so in such a way that appears objective because the headline is Jackson reacts to criticism. It confuses the subject and the object. The real subject of the story is the criticism, but with the headline, I've made Jackson the subject. So before Jackson ran for president, there was a meeting of something called the Trilateral Commission. And the Trilateral Commission included many figures who would go on to work in the Carter administration and the Reagan administration. And this relates to the 2 major political parties. The Trilateral Commission studied what they called the crisis of democracy. And this is interesting because right now we're in a moment in which we are living in a crisis of democracy. But by crisis of democracy, they meant too much democracy. They were reacting to the movements of the 60s and 70s, and they concluded that government was losing its authority, but expanding its operations. And that was code for people are beginning to feel opposed to government policy, and in doing so, insisting on an expansion of government services. So women's rights, civil rights, gay rights, the burgeoning environmental movement, the labor movement, the anti-war movement. And they lamented that President Truman governed at a time where just a few companies and banks really could control the country. They saw this as the crisis of democracy. One of the authors of the Trilateral Commission report went on to become Carter's Secretary of State. Another became Reagan's Secretary of Defense. And another one was Samuel Huntington, who wrote The Clash of Civilizations. And he became an advisor to George W. Bush after the 9/11 attacks. So the crisis of democracy is interesting because it's an Orwellian inversion of the terms, one of which catches up to Jackson when he was leading the race in 1988. There was a time when, after he won the state of Michigan in the presidential primary, it looked as if he might take the nomination. A Democratic superdelegate, and that means it had to have been an elected official, anonymously told the New York Times that what's happening to the party is that a terrorist has a bomb and he's about to blow it up, and we have to work to disarm the bomb. This is how an elected official talked about someone who might very well have become the nominee for president of his or her party, and who, as I said, was ushering millions of new voters into the party. So that's explicit bias. The result is something that we could see in a Daniel Hammond painting, which I write about in the book, called How Do You Like Me Now? This artist in the early 90s for a Washington, D.C. art gallery painted Jesse Jackson with white skin, blonde hair, blonde mustache, and blue eyes. And he scrawled across the canvas, "How do you like me now?" The gallery was twice vandalized. Once by a group of angry black teenagers who thought that the painting was mocking Jesse Jackson, and second, by a group of white people who understood that the painting was mocking them, and they broke the windows and attempted to destroy the painting. Jesse Jackson said that what is offensive is not the painting, but the reality that the painting depicts. And that's a reality of explicit bias meeting implicit bias. If Jesse Jackson was a white man with blonde hair and blue eyes, would President George H.W. Bush have called him a hustler and a thug? And would Newsweek have led with the headline, "What does Jesse want?" Probably not. And we could see that, by the way, when Donald Trump ran for president. You know, there was much criticism of Donald Trump, as there should have been. But for a man who had a lifelong record of swindles and con artistry and grifting, there was very little question that he was sincere in his presidential ambitions to make America great again, or put America first, or whatever inanity he had uttered on Twitter that day. And I write about in the book how cable news didn't exist in during the Jesse Jackson campaigns, but according to a study from the Columbia Journalism Review, these media companies gave Donald Trump millions of dollars of free airtime, the most absurd episode of which was when they spent a half hour on the empty podium at one of his rallies, breathlessly waiting for him to emerge. And yet, I talked to Del Marie Cobb, who was Reverend Jackson's press secretary in the 1988 campaign. Jackson had to resort to doing 12 campaign events a day in order to secure media coverage. He had to go through this marathon onslaught just to get people to pay attention to him. So there's a key difference, and another illustration of how explicit bias meets implicit bias and makes implicit bias. So there are a couple of key terms to remember here as I begin to move into my final points and open it up for questions. Jesse Jackson, as I've already said, has devoted his life to the full-fledged activation of a multiracial democracy in the United States. And in Jackson's work, we can access and surmise the type of history that Howard Zinn writes in his book, A People's History of the United States, the type of political project that W.E.B. Du Bois writes about in several of his books, and the type of multiracial, ecumenical, multi-gendered coalition that everyone from Eugene Debs to Martin Luther King fought to make real. So democracy simply means power invested in the people. And we have a representative democracy, so we have the power to choose our representatives and bring pressure to bear on them so that they serve our interest. Opposed to democracy is oligarchy, and more specifically, a plutocracy, in which we have rule by the wealthy. And that's what I've described over the past 30 minutes. Rule by the wealthy in our media companies and rule by the wealthy in our two major political parties. And it's rule by the wealthy that Jackson threatened, and therefore, in the interest of manufacturing consent by demolishing dissent, we had a multi-decade campaign of slander against Jesse Jackson. And this has happened to others, of course. It happened to Ralph Nader. As I said, it happened to Martin Luther King before Jackson. But obviously, some of these examples are very salient because my book is about Jesse Jackson. Well, oligarchy means rule by the few. And for many years now, we've played with autocracy in this country. Because if we have rule by the few, it's a very short step to rule by the one. And there's another term for that, which many people are afraid to use, but it's fascism. And this is something that Jesse Jackson himself talked about in the 1990s. He identified an extremist, racist strain overtaking the Republican Party, and audible in voices like Rush Limbaugh and in tactics like those of Newt Gingrich. And Jackson, of course, was dismissed as an extremist, as delusional, as living in the past. This is all over. We're progressing. This is a post-racial and post-historical period, land of the free, home of the brave. Don't take a knee during the anthem, so on and so forth. So now we're in this, as Doug said when he introduced me, we're in this imperiled moment in our democracy in which we are facing, in worse and more dangerous form than many decades, a real fascist and threat of autocracy. Voter suppression in many countries. Every day stories are breaking about Trump loyalists trying to seize election positions in various swing states so that they can subvert the intention of the voters. And they're doing all of this openly. I just read a story today in the Texas Monthly about how it's happening in Texas, and the people running for these positions, county election boards, secretary of state, polling place workers, are saying that we have to protect this country from the radical left. So they're brazen in their intention. So this is the danger of explicit bias and implicit bias in a multiracial democracy, that we create a land of fiction, and it's a land of fiction that serves the interests of those who threaten democracy, of those who threaten liberty and justice for all. And because we've allowed this to happen for many years, it's like we're the Titanic moving toward the iceberg. And people such as Jesse Jackson have sounded the alarm for decades, but our ruling institutions and rulers have either tried to snuff that alarm or silence or suppress or ignore it. We find ourselves reaching at a moment where it might be too late to turn the ship. So I'll leave you with just, since that's a very heavy thought, I'll give you a moment of levity. Once when I was at Jesse Jackson's home, he said to me, "I'm sitting with the Pope." And I said, "Which Pope?" He's met several popes. He said, no, this is a joke. I'm not actually with the Pope in this story. I said, okay. And he said, I'm sitting with the Pope on a fishing boat, and his little hat gets picked up by a gust of wind and lands in the water. And I grab the fishing rod, and I cast it, and I hook the hat, and I reel it in, and I set it back on his head, and I say, "Bless you, Holy Father." The headline the next day is "Jackson Can't Swim." So now we're in an era where it may be that none of us can swim. And that's why, this is why, because of the fatal meeting between explicit bias and implicit bias. Jesse Jackson also said that democracy threatens all unjust power systems. So if we're looking for a way to escape this perilous moment, if we're looking for a way to turn the ship and avoid the iceberg, I would refer to the title of this book, I Am Somebody, which is Jesse Jackson's signature call and response affirmation. The first time he uttered those words was at the Poor People's March in the late 1960s. Because of the assassination of Dr. King, the march was a failure, politically speaking. And Jackson, who was leading the march, the people there, poor people of all races and religions, had elected him mayor of Resurrection City. And they asked him to say some final parting words. And Jackson told me, and he's told many other journalists, that he pondered, what can I say to these brothers and sisters of mine, knowing that I can't hand them any substantial victory? And he remembered this old poem, and he asked the crowd to repeat after him. I may be poor, but I am somebody. I may be black, but I am somebody. I may be uneducated, but I am somebody. Similarly, Dr. Martin Luther King said that every human being possesses the quality of somebodyness, meaning some inherent, innate dignity and integrity and value that no one can deny, and those who would attempt to deny should be met with oppositional force. So if democracy threatens all unjust power systems, democracy is that which activates somebodyness. It's that which gives us the opportunity to not only speak, but to live according to the call and creed, I am somebody. So that's the essential message on Jesse Jackson's 80th birthday that he has spent over 60 years attempting to amplify. And I would hope that it would reach all of our ears and we could find ways in our own backyards and in our own hometowns to join together in a rainbow coalition to say, I am somebody, we are somebodies, and therefore we will believe in democracy and make the necessary risks and sacrifices to ensure its survival in the United States of America in the 21st century.
Thank you, David. As